So this morning I'm going to talk about Buddhist texts, the suttas, the scriptures, what we've been handed down in the form of narrative. So I got back late last night from a conference in Chicago, and it was on teacher abuse in Buddhism and the history of that and how it is embedded and talked about in scriptures and texts and been handed down in narrative forms. And it was actually a very rich and emotionally intense, very fulfilling time at the conference. And I could have so many Dharma talks from the 4 days I spent up in Chicago, and the excitement that I was having to be with mostly women in the field who are really kind of cutting edge in this process of looking at Buddhist ethics and teacher abuse in Buddhism. So I was also kind of curious about what am I going to start with? And I wanted to start with this, and I thought, why am I going to something that's a bit more abstract than going right into like the meat of the material or the heart of the material? And I really see that I need more time to process. I just got back last night. There were so many things that were happening, so many rich conversations, and that this is a good model from the reflective meditation practice, is that we don't need to dive into the emotionally intense, charged parts of our lives, that we really can take our time to go into them and let them unfold and have some pause before we have to put everything together and present. So this is the part that I felt most comfortable presenting first. And I went to Northwestern University, and there were two women. Sarah Jacoby is professor of religious studies there, and Damcho Diana Finnegan, who is a PhD doctorate of gender and ethics in Sanskrit and Tibetan narratives. So these two women, she's also a Buddhist nun, but she disrobed and left the order so that she could talk more freely about what's going on in translation. And these were two stellar women, and they had this conversation and presentation, and I was really excited to hear what they had to say. And they started with something that's so familiar in our practice that it was exciting to hear, which is that a text is a narrative. It's a narrative. It's something that's just trying to tell you a story. It's telling you details. It's words that are describing events that happened. And that within that narrative, and this is what Damcho was talking about, which was an interesting presentation, is that there's three worlds within a narrative. There's the world behind the narrative, the world within the story with what's going on, and then there's also the way that narrative impacts you, your others, the world, the community. So that she was really filling out the complexity of a narrative, and the narratives that have been handed down from the Buddha and the way that people have chosen to translate them. And that's where she got to another interesting part, that interpretive choices are always being made in translation, that there's no pure text. You're always having to interpret. And what they are trying to advocate for is interpreting the narratives with ethical obligations. How do we look at these stories, these narratives, and really adhere to what our values are? And the example they brought up is that there's a lot of violence and misogyny in the source materials. What do you do with that? How do you translate that? And believe me, there was a lot of talk about footnotes. This is where footnotes came in. And we spent a lot of time talking about footnotes. I will not, that's a whole nother Dharma talk, but one of the narratives that they looked at, and this was something that Damcho verbalized and articulated that I hadn't heard it before as a narrative, that we look at Buddhism through a narrative of it's going to be lost and it's urgent to save it. And that this narrative runs through a lot of the way texts are translated. It's going to be lost. It's urgent to wake up now. You must save the texts or yourself, type of thing. Now, again, I'm going to extrapolate with my own words here. And if Dom Cho was listening to this, she might say, I didn't say exactly that. So I'm just going to, qualify this with, it's also mixed with my understandings. But when she talked about that, I couldn't help but think, okay, so what do we do when something is urgent and when we're afraid it's going to be lost? How will we start to interpret something? We'll often try to bring in a fix, try to fix it right away. It's very hard to tolerate loss and urgency. We'll also try to nail things down and become more certain about the Buddha said this, you must do that, and stick to some prescriptions. If you do this, then that will happen. I think I know that in myself. When I'm afraid to lose something, I tighten, I narrow, I try to get it more in line so that I can work with it and handle it. The other part was that don't innovate, stick to the script. Really, within that kind of fear of loss, there's a tightness of if you innovate too much, you're going to go way off course, and then we're going to really be lost. And that there's also a sense of really staying with prescribed or contextual, I would say, definitions, that this is what this means always, rather than looking at the context of what this means. And it means something different in different places. And mostly I'm thinking of like the Pali words or the lists that we study, or some of the ways we talk about the teachings of, Four Noble Truths or Four Noble Tasks or Four Ennoblings. We've often been, no, I'm not going to go there yet. One second. I had to think. That's like more of my ending. I of course, when I go to anything, I'm thinking, where does reflective meditation fit into this? Where do we fit into this, transcribing texts? We don't present a lot of sutta material within our practice. We don't present something as a source. We always bring something in with some flexibility and try to talk about our interpretive process. And I'm thinking, our practice isn't looking to fix something. Even when you sit down for meditation, we're not looking to come out with a finished product or an answer. It's often to broaden and open up the meditative process and see what else is there and give more narrative, in fact. We're kind of into questioning the Buddha. We look for suttas that say, where the Buddha said, question me, don't take my words on faith, really know them for yourself. And we're looking to modulate urgency. We're not looking to flare it up. The world is on fire. There are so many emergencies, but we have to also modulate our own sense of urgency so that we can stand within some of the storms or sit within some of the storms. So that practice of trying to kind of fire people up or flare people up really isn't part of our reflective meditation practice. So I guess this morning I wanted to consider that, similar to translating Buddhist texts, that we are doing something of that sort with our meditation sitting, because much of our meditation sitting is in narrative form with some other sense impressions, body sensations, absence of anything, blank spots. and different ways of knowing, but much of it comes through a narrative form. So that in reflection today, maybe consider your meditation sitting more like a sacred text that you're translating, that you are interested in some of the behind the scenes narratives that come from what you're sitting with today. And there may be a lot you don't understand. And it may take a while to trust this process, this translating process of your own source material. And that it takes some effort to do this, to keep it going, and that you're going to have a lot of footnotes. Hee hee. Okay, I'm ending there.